All right, I'll get us started. So welcome. Thank you for joining us to learn about cultivating and sustaining partnerships to create successful change. This webinar is sponsored by the Traumatic Brain Injury Technical Assistance and Resource Center, the TBI TARC, which is funded by the Administration for Community Living and is managed by Human Services Research Institute, HSRI, in partnership with the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators, NASHA. This webinar is free and open to the public. Before we begin, some logistics. Participants are in listen-only mode during this webinar. Please use the chat feature in Zoom to pose questions and communicate with the host. The webinar will be live captioned in English and live interpreted in Spanish. Live English captions can be accessed by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you use ASL interpretation, we encourage you to join on a desktop device, as your mobile device may only show the active speaker. This live webinar includes polls and evaluation questions. Please be prepared to interact during the polling times. Now I'm just going to say a little bit in Spanish. Antes de empezar, quiero decir unas cuantas cosas. Los participantes estarán en modo de solo escucha durante el seminario web. Utilice la función de chat en Zoom para publicar preguntas y comunicarse con los anfitriones. Este seminario web se subtitula en vivo en inglés y en español. Se puede acceder a la interpretación en español en vivo haciendo el clic en el botón Interpretation en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom, el icono del mundo. Una vez en el canal español, por favor, silencie su audio original. Si utiliza la interpretación de ASL, les recomendamos que se una en un dispositivo de escritorio, ya que es posible que su dispositivo móvil solo muestre el orador activo. Este seminario web en vivo incluye encuestas y preguntas de evaluación. Esté preparado para interactuar durante los horarios de votación. A little bit about the TBI TARC. As I mentioned, it is funded by the Administration for Community Living, and it helps the TBI State Partnership Program grantees promote access to integrated, coordinated services and supports for people who have sustained a traumatic brain injury, their families, and their caregiver. The center also provides a variety of resources to non-grantee states, people affected by brain injury, policymakers, and providers. This is some of the key staff of the TBI TARC, and later you'll hear from my colleague, Judy Detmer, who will introduce the presenter, and you will also hear from Maria Crawley, one of my colleagues, but there's other people involved. Just going real quick. Before we begin, we'll do a poll to see who is here. It's helpful for us to see what types of people are joining our webinars, and also for the presenters to know what types of participants are joining the webinar. A poll has popped up, and you just need you select what you self-identify as, and you can select all the apply. One is a person with a TBI or other disability, two, a family member or friend or a person with a traumatic brain injury or other disabilities, self-advocate or advocate, peer specialist, peer mentor, social worker, counselor, care manager, researcher, analyst, service provider, organization employee, or a government employee, whether it's at the federal, state, tribal, or municipal level. I'm going to wait till it reaches around 80%. So we're at 73%, just give a chance. And as I said, you can select all that apply. We're getting there. So we're almost at 80%. Okay. I will just show. So as you can see, we have some good representation with having 33% service researcher. I should go down. 32% are service provider, 43% of the people identify as government employee, 28% is some type of direct care staff, 15% self-advocate, 14% family member, 6% a person with a TBI or other disability, and a peer specialist. So thank you for responding to our first poll. And now I'm gonna have Judy Detmer, my colleague, join, and so that she can introduce our presenter for the webinar. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Very excited to introduce you to our speaker. You can read her full bio, so I'm not going to go into that other than to say her background is human development, and she's been trained as an implementation scientist, which I think is an excellent background for us as we think about sustaining partnerships and ensuring that the work we are doing is something that can be implemented, and we have great strategies for that. I had the privilege of hearing her present previously, which is what led us to reaching out to her for this. I think you guys are in for a great treat to have Julia with us. So Dr. Moore, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. I will share my screen. Thank you, everyone. It is so exciting to be here. I wish I could see all of your faces, but I have lots of interactivity, so get ready to participate, even though we are virtual. Also, I want to flag that we are collecting questions. So if you have questions, thoughts, ideas throughout, please post them in the chat. I am not monitoring the chat, so please don't direct message me. And we're going to talk a lot about relationships, which means sometimes people start thinking about individual people they're thinking about. Don't put people's names or any identifying information in the chat, please, please, please. So a bit about me and what I do. So I was trained as an implementation scientist. So someone who researches the science of how we actually implement, spread, and scale new interventions, new evidence, and new things across the system. But I became passionate, some would say obsessed, with figuring out how we could take that science of implementation that most people don't even realize exists and make it super accessible and practical to the people who are on the ground actually implementing things in the system, whether that's within your organization or across multiple organizations. We know that there are thousands, probably millions of people who are tasked with implementing new things every day, and they are struggling and want to understand how to do that better. And so we are trying to make this science of implementation easier to use and easier to follow. And so I am from the Center for Implementation, and so we do lots of different things related to this. We provide implementation support, just like I described. We have lots of long-term or a few long-term large-scale partnerships for people who are scaling things in the system. And everyone kind of knows us from our online courses and workshops like this. So today I'm going to talk about collaboration, relationships, and how we can understand and leverage what we know about the science of these to improve how we actually go through the system and implement things. Since relationships are actually at the core of like all work that everyone does, unless you like live alone in a forest and don't talk to anyone, I kind of think that this is relevant to kind of everyone. And once I started learning about it, it made me wish that this had been like foundational knowledge that we learned about in school long before we got to this stage. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit and grounding us in the different ways in which we think about collaborations and a bit of the worldview that I am coming from. So some of the things I'm going to share, you're going to have to adapt and interpret to fit your own setting, depending on what kind of organization you're working in, what kind of relationships you're building in your work. So the first thing I want to start by mentioning is that the primary people I am thinking about when I do all of my work is people called that we call implementation support practitioners. These are the people who are on the ground supporting the implementation of different programs or practices or guidelines or interventions in one or multiple settings. They almost never have the job title implementation support practitioner, but they serve the function of doing this work. And so here is our image of some of the functions that these people serve. They try to understand what's happening in the system. They try to understand different people's perspectives. They try to connect with people to make the work happen. They try to inspire people to make change. They try to enable changes by removing barriers. And ideally, they try to transform themselves in the process of transforming the system. And so this is based on core competencies work that we have developed, but I really wanted to flag these because this is kind of this tree is where we are going to spend most of our time today. And so a large part of everyone's role who is supporting implementation in any way is to build relationships, because we can never implement anything if we don't have relationships with other people. And so we try to take what we know about relationships and kind of put it into a pathway. And we call this the relational pathway. It's the how of bringing people together. And it has 5 key activities. 1, convening people. So we actually have to bring people together when we are trying to have relationships with other individuals or organizations or groups. We also want to partner and figure out what it means to work together, define our roles, figure out how people are contributing. The third one, I'm going to admit, is my least favorite, but I have grown to understand the key importance of governance. That's things like, how are we making decisions? And are we being transparent about how we make decisions? We also have to figure out how we work together as a team, especially if that team has people in multiple organizations, multiple states, maybe multiple different places. And that's really important as we start thinking about working with people across the system. And so one other thing I'll share related to relationships is called the collaboration spectrum. And so there are many collaboration spectrums out there. And if you have one that you are using and that you love, keep using it. But if you don't, here's one that we have grown to like a lot. And the reason I like it is because it has these first 2 pieces that are often not included in collaboration spectrums. The first one is recognizing the reality that it's not uncommon to collaborate with people that we simultaneously are in competition with. So we see this where sometimes, say, organizations are collaborating on one project, but competing against each other for funding for something else. We see that with researchers all the time as well. So like lots of times we're collaborating and competing. Sometimes we're coexisting. We're not actively doing anything together, we just coexist, and that's good to know. Sometimes we have a relationship where we're just exchanging knowledge. So there's nothing deep, it's just like, hey, FYI, we're doing this, you're doing this, okay, we'll keep you in the loop. Sometimes we do what we call as needed joint work. So kind of like, ooh, we're working on a project and it seems like a great opportunity to collaborate on this specific thing. We're gonna work together on this specific thing. As we move down the spectrum, we could think about how we might collaborate on ongoing joint work. So not just one project, but maybe we could see how we could collaborate more long-term on a couple of different things, which ultimately leads us towards official collaboration, which is kind of that longer-term interaction where we've recognized that we might have a shared mission, a shared vision of where we want this to go. And we're going to be much more intentional about how we collaborate, not just on a project, but more holistically. And finally, we acknowledge that sometimes, and we're actually seeing this more and more, organizations or groups are even considering how they could merge together rather than have a collaboration to really bolster what is happening. So that was kind of a preview to set us up to talk about how in our work, we need to work with other people. And we can work with other people in so many different ways. But at the core of doing that work, we need to understand the science of how we trust each other and how we deal with power dynamics. And I'm going to be totally transparent. So I was a researcher and I loved using theories and models and frameworks. And I did all of this in implementation science, right? I was like, oh, I want to learn about how to use this framework. How can we make it practical for people? How can we make it accessible to people? And lots of people were coming to us a few years ago saying, that's great. I love your frameworks. I love other people's frameworks. I have relationship challenges I am dealing with that I need to figure out how to overcome before I can even do any of the things you're talking about. And so that kind of forced us to dig into the science of how we actually build trusting relationships, and the science of how we deal with power dynamics. So I'm going to share a few tips about how to do this. And I want to flag that Carrie has put in the chat a link to a resource that has more details about some of the things I'm talking about if you want to go a little deeper. So what does the science tell us about how to build trust? Well, we've tried to distill this down into a process we call the cultivate process. And so the cultivate process at a high level has kind of these three big phases. First, we try to assess the context. Then we want to reflect on our own contributions to the work. And then we start selecting actions for the self and for the situation. So let me get into that in a little more detail. In the first phase, we do things like identify what the general thing is that you're trying to address. So for example, maybe you're trying to partner with a new organization and you're trying to figure out what that would look like. Step 1B, you try to figure out, hey, what stage of the relationship are we at? Is this a brand new relationship? Do we have an existing relationship? Is that kind of a good relationship? Or maybe there's a relationship and there's a lot of tension. How you move forward really is affected by what has happened in the past, if anything at all. And then we like to do a little piece around rating our relationship in terms of trust and power. And I'm going to talk about both of those in a moment. Once we get into kind of phase 2, we start really unpacking trust and power in a lot more detail. So 2A is about identifying what it is that is impacting trust. This leads us to thinking about power, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and then kind of leading us to figure out how can we reflect on that analysis of trust and power, and what are our goals moving forward. So we try to be really thoughtful and intentional in this work, because trust and power really affect how we all show up, how we interact in the work that we do. So many of us don't realize, I was surprised to learn, in fact, that there are 4 key types of trust. We have strategic trust. So for example, do you believe in the initiative that you're working on? Hopefully you do, but I'll admit that sometimes we're working with people and I realize they don't have strategic trust in, say, the program that they're trying to implement. Is there trust between organizations and groups? Is there trust between individual people, like personal trust? And is there trust within organizations and groups? I'm going to focus on these 3 here, especially personal and within, but we're also going to talk a bit about trust across different organizations. So many years ago, several years ago, I was trying to figure out how to teach people about the science of trust and the ideas and all the things I was reading about, all the podcasts I was listening to about what we know about trust. And I have 2 little boys. They're currently 7 and 11, but they were much younger. So I think they were about 4 and 7 or so at the time. And we were sitting around playing with Lego blocks. And so my older son had built this beautiful, beautiful tower that was kind of like quite wide and up and very secure. And my youngest son had taken the Lego blocks, like one individual 2x2 block, and had just piled them really, really high. But they were just like the one block. And we have these 2 crazy kittens, and they ran into the room and sure enough, knocked over my youngest son's Lego tower. And I'm like sitting there like playing Lego and also thinking about work and the science of trust and how I can explain this to people. And all of a sudden I look around at these Lego blocks everywhere. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is totally what I've been reading about and learning about trust. Trust happens through a series of tiny little interactions that we have with people. The way we show up at a meeting, the email we send, the little comment that we make when we acknowledge or recognize that we remembered something that someone did on the weekend or something they said last week. It's these little tiny moments that accumulate that make it that we trust other people and they trust us. And so essentially with everyone, we are building towers of trust without even realizing it. And sometimes we are building towers that have very stable bases that don't get knocked over when bad things happen or unexpected things happen. And sometimes we're building towers of trust that are not very stable, so that it is very, very easy for them to fall over. And so when we understand what makes up a tower of trust, we can show up differently to hopefully lead to more trusting relationships. But I need to emphasize, you cannot make someone else trust you, just like they cannot make you trust them. You can show up differently to make it as easy as possible to build a trusting relationship, but you cannot force that to happen if it is not going to happen. So what makes up these key pieces in our tower of trust? Well, there are 3 key things in a tower of trust. We trust other people and they trust us when we feel a sense of connection. So that is having things like shared values or other things that we have in common. It's easier to trust people if they're non-judgmental, or we don't think or feel like they're being judgmental, or if they have generosity of intentions, which is kind of like assume the best. So say like you say something, and you know how some people like assume the worst in what you have said or done, and some people assume the best. It's easier to trust people when they assume the best. And it's easier to trust people when they show up and they have empathy towards us. We trust other people and they trust us when, this is 2-way, when we believe they are competent and when we believe they think we are competent. So I'm going to repeat that because it's both directions. So we have to, for us to trust people and for them to trust us, we have to believe they are competent and we have to believe that they think we are competent. We also are more likely to trust people when we believe they are showing up authentically. For example, when we feel like they have really clear boundaries, that they respect confidentiality, that they have integrity. And people are often surprised to learn showing up authentically means having some level of vulnerability when we show up. That's part of showing up in this really authentic way. So with that, I'm going to lead us into our first activity. So we have put these in polls. So our first poll, which should hopefully pop up, I haven't seen it yet, is perfect. At the start of a team meeting, imagine a new collaborator shares their personal story about why they are committed to this work. Do you think this is an example of them building connection, showing competence, or showing authenticity? I'll give you a moment to add your things to the poll. Amazing. We're getting a little closer. We'll wait for a couple more. All right. I'm going to end the poll. So it looks like we have, and I think share results. I think you can now see them. Can the interpreter give me a thumbs up if you can see them? Can you see the poll results?
We can see them, Julia. Yep.
You can see that, perfect. Okay. Okay, so it looks like connection and authenticity are the top 2 and a lot less people saying competence, and I would agree. So when we share our personal story, that's us showing up really authentically, saying this is why I'm here. And that also often relates to finding shared values, like what are my values and how are they shared with other people? So I would really place it in that kind of like space between authenticity and connection. Okay, next poll question. Let me make sure this worked. Okay, second poll question. One of my colleagues seems overconfident. They rarely ask questions and never admit when they don't know things. So I might not trust this person a lot. And what is it that's making me not trust them that much? Give it another 10 seconds and then close the poll. All right. Perfect. And poll, and I will share the results. So here, yeah, the majority of people are putting it in the first place I would put it, which is confidence. So when we are overconfident, it actually makes people question our competence. So literally showing up and being overconfident makes people question whether or not we know anything at all. And so that's the first place I would probably put it. I can see an argument for some of these other two, but that's definitely the first place I would go to put that one. Okay, third example. Imagine you overhear a conversation between a community partner and a project lead. The community partner has multiple relevant questions, and the project lead dismisses their concerns with a judgmental tone of voice. What would you say this is an example of seeing in this moment? Results are coming in fast on this one. All right, I'll give it about 10 more seconds and then I will close this poll down. Okay, and share results. So most people put connection, and that's the first place I would put it too, is when people are showing up judgmentally, it really kind of does the opposite of building a connection. Now I'm going to get you to shift your mindset just a little bit. I want you to think in your head, do not say it out loud, do not type it in a box, think of your head about someone where you kind of have a lack of trust in both directions. You don't really trust them and they don't really trust you. What affected your trust? Why do you not trust this other person? Give it about 10 more seconds. Perfect. So it is fascinating. I have asked this question many, many times to thousands and thousands of people, and authenticity always shows up as the number one reason that we say we don't trust other people, always. Now, I'm going to ask you one last question. So still thinking about the same person, you don't really trust them. Why is it that you think that they don't trust you? Right, I'll give you about 10 more seconds. So why do you think they don't trust you? And remember, no one can tell who you're talking about. No one can tell why. So let me share this with you. So here people talked about connection, then competence, and then authenticity was much, much lower. And so one of the things I think that's so interesting about this, having asked this to like thousands of people, is think about the math behind that. We don't trust other people because we think they're not showing up authentically. And yet we believe that other people don't trust us, either because there's a lack of connection or because they don't think we're competent. And so what are we kind of taking away from this? One of the things I always take away is, ooh, the math behind that doesn't work out perfectly, which means there's a good opportunity to try to show up a little bit more authentically in what it is that we are doing. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears for a moment. So thank you for participating in our little polls. We will have another one in a bit. I'm going to talk quickly about navigating power dynamics. So there's a lot to unpack about power. And so we have this visual called the dimensions of power that talks about lots of things. And it is in the handout that Carrie has put in the chat. So there are lots more things to learn about power. I'm going to focus on one dimension of power. We call this types of power. And it's the thing we most often think about when we think about power. There are 4 types of power. The first type of power is power over. And this is the type of power that we most often think about when we think about power. This is the idea that someone has power over us, like a boss has power over me, or some decision maker has power over me, or my kids have been saying like, Mom, you're the one who has power over me in this situation. Stop having control over me, right? So it's like power over is the thing we think about often when we think about power. But there are other types of power. Power with happens when we lend each other power to collaborate on something and to move it forward. This is when we're kind of like giving power to other people, we're working together with other people in order to collectively have more power than we might individually have. Power 2 is when we're lending power to other people to move the work forward. So if we are giving our power to other people in order to help them move the work forward, we are lending power to other people. These often happen in coordination with each other. I see that very often, but they don't have to. My favorite, I'm going to be honest, learning about power kind of scared me. But once I started learning about power within, I don't know, I got very excited and very into it. Power within is about understanding our own individual source of power. We like to call these our jewels of power. And so understanding our power within is so important in situations where we feel powerless. And in our work of supporting people to do implementation, we find that people often feel very powerless in the work that they are doing. And so when we can think differently about power and recognize that power is not always a power over situation, but we can think about those collaborations. Remember early on, I showed that spectrum of collaboration. We can think, ooh, how could I have power with others or power to achieve something? Or how could I better understand my own power within? I feel like it really transforms how we approach the situation and how we approach the work that we're doing. So before we get into our next activity, I'm going to share a little bit more about the jewels of power. So the idea of the jewels of power is that we all have jewels of power. These are things that we have and we hold and that no one can take away from us ever, ever, ever. So I'm born in May, so I like to think of my jewels of power as emeralds, because that's the birthstone for May. So my jewels of power are emeralds. And I recognize and understand that I can walk into a physical or virtual room and have situations where people really value the jewels of power that I have and that I am bringing to the table. And there are other times I will enter a space and people do not value the jewels of power that I am bringing. But what's great about thinking about them as jewels of power is it's recognizing that even when people don't value the jewels of power that I have, that I hold, that I bring, I still hold those, even though they might not value them. They are still my jewels of power and I do not lose them. And I want to flag that these jewels of power can look very diverse. So I'll share 2 of my jewels of power so that hopefully you can think about what some of your jewels of power are. So one of my jewels of power is that I am a very empathetic person. Just like naturally, I am an empathetic person. I have been since I was quite young. And that is a jewel of power that I have and I can hold. And remember that empathy is one of the ways that we connect with people. And so I can use that jewel of power in helping build and foster relationships with people. Another jewel of power that I have is the ability to take complicated implementation science or sciencey things and try to make them really practical. And so again, some people might not care about that at all, but it does not take away the fact that that is a jewel of power that I have, and I can choose to bring it out whenever I want. And so I love for everyone to take just like 10 seconds to pause and hopefully think of at least one jewel of power that you have that no one can take from you, that you can bring anywhere you want to go. So with that, we're going to go into our next activity. So here we have another poll. And so I'm going to ask you, thinking about these different types of power, power over, power with, power to, and power within. What types of power have you seen or experienced in the past month? And you can click more than one, so you don't have to click only one. All right, I'll give it a couple more seconds. I'll share results. So actually, this was exciting. There's a great diversity here. Power with and power within showed up as like the top two, which makes me so happy. I feel like sometimes people power over shows up more than the others. And so I don't know, I think that's just wonderful, wonderful, and amazing to see. So next poll, what types of power are you interested in exploring more? So imagine you were like, ooh, what types of power are you like, oh, I'd love to learn a little bit more about this. And there's an excellent question in the chat. So to me, power to is the same as empower. And so I would say both yes and it depends. So I think that for many people, that is true. And for me, that was also true. I was like, ooh, power to is like saying to empower people. There are some people who do empowerment work really specifically related to empowering people that have very nuanced definitions of like who is in a position to empower others and what exactly does that look like, who would say, ooh, like if you're going to get into technicalities, maybe it's not always true. But from a like having conversations with people, I think that talking about power to as empowering others is really kind of in line with the way that lots of people think about it. So great question or comment. All right, so I'm going to end this poll. Sorry, I took longer because I answered the question and share the results. So people are really interested in learning about power within as the number one. So that is awesome. Power with and power to. So hopefully you can think about how some of these might look in the work that you do. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about how we can use some of this information to start coming up with actions to cultivate trust and power. So remember, this process starts with like understanding the context. What are you trying to achieve? Who you're trying to build relationships with? Reflecting on trust and power and the goals that we have. And then we want to select actions to move this work forward. And so when we select actions, we're really like developing an action plan. And I'm going to show you a tool that can help you do this. So this tool is called the Cultivate tool. You can use this QR code to link you out or the link. And I am going to, hopefully this will just work. Thank you, Carrie, put it in the chat. And it will take you to a page that looks like this. So you would scroll down into this tool. You have to have done the pre-work to understand trust and power. And then you go in and you click start. And I might say, ooh, I am trying to figure out how I can build trusting relationships between us and this other organization. I'm going to go into trust and I'm going to say, hey, I remember that when I was at this talk, Julia talked about authenticity being super important. So I'm going to start there. And I might say, I'm interested to know, how could I show up authentically as an organization, not just as a person? How do I show up authentically as an organization? And so you can go and click here. And it gives you actions that you can take, like cultivating a values-based shared purpose, to talk about organizational values out loud. My favorite one is to be transparent about why you show up and what it is you want out of a partnership with someone. Things like owning up to mistakes, even developing confidentiality agreements, are different actions that we have found in the literature that can help organizations show up authentically. You might then say, oh, I also want to do a good job of showing up authentically. And so it links you to other actions that you might take as an individual, as opposed to as an organization. And you might then say, ooh, I'm interested to see how this relates to power. So we have these little boxes that shows the food for thought about how this aspect of trust relates to power, because they're kind of intricately linked and really cannot be teased apart. Then I might go back here and think, I'm interested to learn more about how to build connection, maybe at an individual level, and it'll show you different things we found from the literature. Like some of them are simple. Using a person's name when communicating with them, in writing or orally. And I want to flag that using their name correctly. That means pronouncing it correctly and spelling it correctly. My colleague, Sobia, has a name, 5 letters, S-O-B-I-A. And it is spelled incorrectly every single week in emails. Often in emails that literally are responses to her. So her name is in the email. And it immediately changes the trust dynamic if someone is not spelling or saying your name correctly. And there's lots of other ideas, practicing active listening, acknowledging people's ideas and contributions. So there's lots of different actions you can take and you can play around in there. I also want to flag, you might think, ooh, I want to explore more about power. Lots of people said, we talked about types of power. They said, ooh, I'm interested in things like power with. And so it gives you some different actions you can take if you want to create and maintain power with. And some people were interested in power within. And so again, you can look at that and look at power within. And you might also think, ooh, how do these relate to trust? And so we again have food for thought over there. So this is a tool that anyone can go and access. You can bring it to your teams. You can have conversations. So we're seeing that all the time. Individual people using it to figure out, ooh, what does this mean for me? But especially teams saying, hey, we're trying to build a trusting relationship. How can we do that? How can we show up more authentically? How can we build a connection with this new organization? How can we kind of build this sense of we're competent and so are they? So I'm going to jump us back over here. Last thing I'm going to say about this before we jump to an activity again is I wanted to flag that one of the things we're hearing over and over again related to trusting relationships that we heard in prep for this workshop is that people are finding it challenging because there's so much staff turnover that it sometimes feels like you build a relationship with a person and then they're gone. And so that makes it super challenging to figure out what to do. And so we think here are some tips. One is to cultivate relationships with the person and with the organization. So that means being involved in other things rather than with just one single person can be really helpful. And think of that bi-directionally, like within your organization, who else could you loop in, and in another organization, right? And so having that reciprocity, like, oh, I'm going to bring my colleagues along because I think it will be helpful for them to also know how we're working together or what we're thinking about, and then kind of inviting that reciprocity. Other things are knowing what parts of your initiative are more easily changeable and to get input and tailor to their organization. So when people have a greater sense of ownership, it is much more likely to be sustained. And so when we're trying to build strong relationships with people, if we can kind of think about, ooh, how can we help other individuals or other organizations feel a greater sense of ownership, it kind of helps build a more sustainable relationship. And then it could also be helpful to think about what outcomes are important to this partnership and make sure that we're kind of like staying on track and measuring or like acknowledging those on a regular basis, because that actually also helps that people want to sustain relationships that they have with people. So from there, I have an in the chat question for people. So thinking about, I talked about a lot of different things. Cultivate tool, I talked about the trust and power that people might have. I talked about so many different ways we can think about collaborations with people. And so I would love for people to share, perhaps in the chat, where and how could you use something like the Cultivate tool? And if you can share ideas, sometimes it's very helpful for other people to see, oh yes, that is a great way that I could share that with colleagues, or I could do that in a team meeting, or whatever that is. So if people are open to sharing, that would be amazing. And I also want to flag, if people have questions, they can also continue to post those in the chat. Oh, excellent. So great things. Building a new team, identifying strategies to strengthen relationships with other state agencies. And we like this, managing expectations and boundaries to stay focused, staff development, building trust with organizations and inside my team, networking, working with other agencies, religious men's group, learning about group dynamics. Oh, someone's doing an e-learning. Yeah, Strengths Finder. So this really aligns very, very nicely with the Strengths Finders work. Onboarding, annual bonding, awesome. Conferences, building trust is a major issue. Building trust with organizations, maybe for marketing, partnership with clients rather than over them. Oh, I love that, Sarah. Fabulous. Virtual work environment. Yeah. So we get that question all the time too, is like, what about if you're virtual? We are completely virtual. I live out in the middle of nowhere. And so we find that these things are even more important and maybe don't happen as organically. So we have to sometimes like show up a little bit differently in order to bring these to the table, right? So how we build connection looks different if you happen to bump into someone, as opposed to if you are only in a virtual space. After crisis with clients, as staff are debriefing and healing from their own experience. Jack, I really like that. Awesome. All right, so we are getting to Q&A. We have lots of time. So just flagging that tool is free. Anyone in the world can go and access it and use it. And everything I pulled from today is from this course called Cultivating Trust and Navigating Power. So that's where kind of the source where you could learn more about any of those pieces of information. So with that, we are going to jump into a Q&A. And so if anyone has any questions, you can go and type them in the chat where we can see those. And I see some people are still adding ways they could use some of this. For example, convening affinity groups, coalitions, learning team members' strengths, frustrations, and weaknesses. Oh, I think that's such a great thing to do, Meg, is when we understand people's strengths. Do you know what the jewels of power are for everyone on your team? Do people know that you know their jewels of power? I think that when we do that, it really changes a lot of the trust dynamics that are happening. Oh, awesome. Peter mentions working with youth who are trying to learn self-advocacy. Amazing. I'll give everyone a moment in case there's any questions. Well, we will stay for questions if people have more questions, but I wanted to say a super thank you for all of your engagement. We don't often do polls and I wasn't sure how it would work, but it went fabulously. So thank you for all of your engagement. And I will hand it back over to the coordinators. Again, we are here if you want to add any questions into the chat, but thank you all for so much fabulous participation. This was wonderful.
I'll jump in and say thank you so much, Dr. Moore. That was an excellent presentation and really engaging. We appreciate that. And I've already taken away a few tools that I will be using, and I have a few examples of what I'll be using them for. So I appreciate the practicality of your presentation. I guess as you said, we can hang on for a little bit and see if people have questions.
And we actually have, and if not, we can also Julia, if you can stop sharing.
Yes, sorry. Perfect.
And then, okay. So it's not. We thank you everyone for joining us today. And we want to do one more poll question.
Yes.
And this helps us to, sorry, I'm trying to make this big and I can. But anyway, we're gonna the poll is on. We just want to do an evaluation of how the webinar went, and we use this for improving our webinars, and we will share them with the presenter, with Dr. Moore. Thank you so much. This was really informative. I learned a lot, and definitely there's more room to grow. And I love the tools that you provided, and they will be very useful. I should stop sharing because I'm not doing this too well here. Sorry, it's like I was, as I mentioned before, we are part of the Technical Assistance and Resource Center, and nope, it's taking me. Sorry, I wanted to say how you can get in touch with us. We are part of the Technical Assistance and Resource Center for TBI, and you can feel free to contact us. One of the team members will put our email address, which is tbitarc@hsri.org. The recording and the slides will be posted on the ACL website, and we will send a copy of the link once it's available. It will take about a few weeks, just because it has to be posted by them. And thank you so much, and we hope to see you all soon. I don't know if any other questions have come
There
in.
is a question about direct TA. Someone's wondering if they can get direct technical assistance related to the Activate tool.
I mean, I don't think that we don't have direct TA for the Cultivate tool, but it is out there. It is free. Lots of people can use it, and like anyone can go in. And so I would say, so two things. One is you can go in and use it, work with other people to work through the whole process. There is an entire course that kind of leads people through the process to get to the tool that I would say is the other alternative, but otherwise it's there and anyone can kind of go in and use it. And it's pretty self-explanatory, probably our most self-explanatory tool, because we all have relationships with people.
Thank you. And I hope you're taking a minute to look at the chat, Julia, because there's some amazing comments in there about the presentation. So reaffirming that it was a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, someone else talked about reflecting on jewels of power and kind of like intersectionality of our power, of our identity. And so we have thought a lot about those in how we built out the tool, and a lot of equity questions that we have considered in building this out. So that's kind of deeply ingrained in how the tool was set up and designed.
Great.
Thank you. Any other questions in there?
Just more comments.
Oh, someone just put in.
Yeah. I can read this out, but some of these things are similar to motivational interviewing basics of starting with engagement and listening with the intent to understand without judgment, assumptions, and meeting people where they are at. My organization focus on working with people living with brain injury. These are all helpful in our team building and with their clients. The goal is to help people live the life they choose. We do that through autonomy, support, and empowerment. Thank you for this. Always nice to learn more. That's a great comment. Thank you.
It is, Meg. And actually, I love it when people see sources. So motivational interviewing is one of the sources for how we uncovered what does the research say about building trust. And so kind of it's like, how can we take the principles of motivational interviewing and make them kind of like daily practices that people can use on a regular basis. So I'm super impressed that you can see through those little pieces.
Thank you. We hope everyone has a good afternoon, good morning, if it's still morning where you're at. And thank you for joining us today.
I think there's one more
Actually,
question. Sorry.
sorry.
Yeah, Tracy, I see. I see Tracy's question. So we have never, quote, tested this with rebuilding trust when it is broken. We know many people who are doing this. For example, I live in Canada, and who are doing this while working with Indigenous communities where there is a lot of broken trust. And so I don't know that I would say it has been tested, but I think that there are people who are trying to use some of these principles, right? Like lots of these things are, they're not, it's not a concrete thing you can do. It's like how you show up differently, how you are really transparent around your motives and why you're there. So I don't know that it's tested per se, but I think that they are trying to embody and how we can show up, especially in situations where there is a history of broken trust and maybe a history of some ills done to people, sometimes in very dramatic ways. And so how can we kind of show up differently and recognize that? Yeah, so restorative justice, exactly. Awesome.
Great. So if no other questions or comments, then thank you, and we will see you all soon, hopefully.
Thank you
Thank you.
all.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr. Moore, for
you.
such a great presentation. And thank you for everyone that supported this.